Hi, I'm Carmen Geddes with 10 Sisters Handicraft, and I'm here at Riley Blake Designs today, and we are going to have a pincushion party. But we're going to do the piecing a little bit differently. We're going to be piecing these squares on a fusible foundation called Easy Piecing Grid. So let's talk about what we're going to be needing for the project today. One thing I want to point out is this fusible foundation comes in different sizes, and when we print this, we print these by the finished size. So today, even though I've got these cute little 1/2-inch finished squares here, today we're actually going to be piecing on the 1-inch finished. And so the 1-inch finished uses a 1.5-inch cut square. So these panels are labeled by the finished size of squares, and we actually print in 4 sizes, starting with 1/2-inch finished all the way up to 2-inch finished. So we have our fusible foundation that we're going to use today. We've got just this is our backing, our background square for the pincushion that we're going to make, and I've used a 5-inch square. We just have a square of regular iron-on interfacing to stabilize that. We've got our cute little point turners as we turn these pincushions inside out. We have a little funnel because we're going to be filling the pincushion with these cracked walnut shells. And then we've got a needle and thread right here, a thimble, which always comes in handy, a washable glue stick. We have our squares already cut out into 1.5-inch squares and some scissors. I'm using a nice little travel size iron today, so you want an iron sewing machine set up to regular straight stitch 1/4-inch piecing. Okay, so like I said, these little pincushions that we have to show you are 1/2-inch finished, and that was the foundation we used for those, but we are going to use the 1-inch finished. So let's move some of this out of our way a little bit. I guess it's actually all right. Okay, so I've actually started a few of these little pincushions, and so when we're piecing on this foundation, you'll see that the squares, I'm going to show you, spread this out and show you. So the squares are printed on the smooth side of this. This is fusible, so if you don't remember anything else that I say, we want to make sure that this fusible side is up. So we're going to turn this over so that the fusible side or bumpy side is up. So that's what I've got over here. It's a little hard to see the lines on that pressing mat. So the fusible side is up. You're going to cut out your squares, but if you notice what we've got here, we've got some cute little sawtooth star blocks. And so as I'm laying out some of these squares, I'm going to put these I'm going to fuse these, line up or iron these pincushions right next to each other. But I just want to give you a little explanation of these little traditional blocks that we're going to sew up. And so when you're piecing with half-square triangles on this foundation, you're going to pre-sew these half-square triangles. And you can use any technique that you like, your favorite technique, and you are going to let's see if I can talk and place squares at the same time. So you're going to sew up those half-square triangles using your favorite technique, and then you are going to place them on the foundation just like I'm doing. And I'm going to run out of turquoise squares, so we're going to put in some blue here. That matches really cute. So you're going to place those half-square triangles right on the foundation just like you do the squares. But the trick to getting those points to turn out really nice every time is we're going to line up the seam of the half-square triangle from corner to corner, and that's it. So one thing you're going to notice with these that are already ironed down, you're going to see that I've got a little gap in between some of my squares, and obviously some of my cutting and sewing is not perfect, but the squares fit inside the printed square, right? And that's the whole point. Now, if my fabric squares were a little bit bigger, they could be butting right next to each other. It's what you want to avoid is your squares overlapping, and that's going to make a lot of sense when we start to sew. So I've got these squares lined up. Now I'm going to put my iron right on top of this, but I want to be very aware that this is still fusible. But my fabric is here and my foundation is here. So when I am putting my iron over the top, I'm not really worried that that's going to get on my iron. But I'll tell you, an applique pressing sheet is a great tool that you can use. Now, notice I'm not doing this with my iron, right? We're not moving that iron all over. I'm just holding it still, and I'm just making sure these are nice and fused down. So do you see how we don't have any little corners lifting up? And so I'm going to just cut out this one pincushion just so we can get through one project. I'm just cutting right next to the fabric. But as you can see, and I'll kind of show you a little bit later, you can lay these out right next to each other and fill up that whole panel with all sorts of cute little pincushions. And isn't that fun little scrappy checkerboard? Just so fun. All right, so now these are all ironed down, and so I don't have any little corners lifting up. Now, let me move over to here. We can see it a little bit better. One thing I just want to point out, usually I try not to point out when I am not perfect in my cutting, but I was telling you that it's okay if you do see a little bit of a gap, because when we are all ironed down, then we're going to take this over to the sewing machine. We're going to fold this on that fold line, which is the dotted line, and sew your 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then we're going to fold the next one and sew the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So essentially, we are giving you plenty of room to fold, and even though there's a little bit of a gap, that's going to fit safely inside that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so basically what I'm saying is your cutting does not have to be perfect because that foundation is. So now we are ready to go over to the sewing machine. One thing that you can do is lower your stitch length just a little bit. Sometimes I will just lower that to just a little bit tighter stitch. And then I do like to, when I start to sew, I do like to do a little bit of a back stitch. And then we're going to sew our 1/4 inch seam. Now the seam allowance is not marked, because if we all sat down to sew together, we would have a lot of different 1/4 inch seam allowances. And so we do not print. Now, one thing, after you sew that first seam, I'll just tell you a little trick. This loves to get caught in your second seam. Ask me how I know that. So you want to make sure this one is folded out and out of the way. Fold that second one right on the fold line. And we're going to sew these 3 seams in the one direction. Oh, I got some cute little scissors I'll use. All right, we have one more seam, and then we're going to go to the next step. These are also really fun to make mug rugs out of, right? So you're knowing that this is going to finish at 1 inch each of these squares, you can basically make this with as many squares that you want to. Okay, so now I'm going to come back over to the iron, and we'll see if we can show you this. Okay, so now this is the seam that you just sewed. So what we're going to do is we are going to clip right between each of those squares right up to the stitch line. And so do you see, you can actually kind of see the little dotted lines, so it's showing you exactly where to cut. So we're going to do that on each of these 3 seams that we cut. And snip. Now, even if you happen to snip through the stitching, this is all held together by this foundation, so it's not going to shift or move. But the reason why we do that snip is so that we can press these seam allowances going opposite directions. Isn't that fun? And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the iron. Now, you can kind of decide. Sometimes I like to use steam when I'm doing this. It really kind of does the work. for us, but I do love these little irons. So I'm pressing the one seam going one direction, and then I just fold that row under, right? Now because this is so little, I'm just gonna press the next seam going the opposite direction. I'm just gonna kind of hold it there. We just wanna press that in place, so give that some memory. So do you see how this one's going this way, and now we're gonna fold it on the fold line and press the other one. Isn't that pretty slick? And so we have one last row to press. I'm just gonna go this way. And then sometimes for good measure, and this is especially when I am doing this on a bigger quilt, then I like to turn it over and give it a press from the front, because it's really easy. It's really easy to get these little folds here between the squares, and we want this to be really nice and flat. And so the reason that you are going to do that clipping and the pressing is now look what happens. Now it's time to fold right sides together to sew the other direction. And look at how those seams are all nested perfectly. And so, oops, that one's supposed to be going that way. So those are nested perfectly. So there's no pinning or adjusting. We're gonna just go back over to the sewing machine and sew these seams the other way. And again, I like to do a little back stitch. Now even with traditional piecing, when you do chain piecing and you're kind of going back the other direction, you need to pay attention to this seam allowance that's underneath, because as it's going under the foot, sometimes it likes to flip the wrong way. So just kind of be mindful of that. And make sure that that seam is going the way it's supposed to do. A little back stitch. Little snips. This is kind of fun, just 3 seams each way. Fold it on that fold line. So when we were talking about the half square triangles on a more traditional, like a star block, laying the seam of that half square triangle from corner to corner is going to really make sure those points come out really nice. All right, last seam, fold it on that fold line, and a little back stitch all the way through. Alrighty. So, ta-da, the world's smallest quilt top. But what's so fun, because this is pieced on the foundation, what I want you to notice is all those intersections. Those just turn out perfect every single time. And we did not use one pin. Did you notice that? There's no pins in my pincushion. So now after we sew the second seam, and again, this is where I do like to use some steam, but it's a pincushion, right? And if this was, if I was doing this on a quilt, I would definitely be using the steam. It's gonna do 2 things. It's gonna really, we're letting the steam do the work, and it's gonna keep this foundation really nice and soft. So, ta-da, our little pincushion top is all done and ready to go. Clip some of these little extra threads out of the way. Make that nice and clean. Okay, so now, this is, depending on seam allowance, this technically should be 4.5 inches, but my seam allowances are a little bit more on the scant side, so it turned out unfinished. It's almost right at 5. So I've got a 5-inch square, and then that square of plain iron-on interfacing, we take and we just fuse it to the back of this, which I already did. And what that's doing is it's just stabilizing the underneath side. It's just the bottom of your pincushion. It's just stabilizing that. And so now we are going to put these right sides together. Now I do suppose at this point I could use some pins, but I didn't put any in my pincushion. So we're going to put these right sides together, bring it over to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew this up. Oh, they are not right sides together. Ho, ho, ho. Right sides together. right? And we're gonna bring it over. Now, we're gonna be sewing this up just like a little pillow, okay? So what we need to be sure of is that we're gonna leave a little opening. And basically, I'm gonna just start at the seam allowance, or start at the seam allowance rather here, and sew all the way around the outside with a 1/4 inch and stop at this one. So that is gonna leave a little opening here. So we're gonna start here. Can you tell that I don't really like pinning? I didn't even bring them over. We'll see how I do. So I do a little back stitch, and we're gonna stop at a 1/4 inch away from the edge there and sink that needle in, pivot. Now again, watch those seam allowances, because this seam allowance is gonna wanna flip back as you sew over it. All the way, we're gonna stop. Now you can just go all the way to the end and do a little back stitch, you know, because we're turning this inside out like a pillow, that kind of reinforces that corner a little bit. And it might be easier to do than trying to stop exactly a 1/4 inch away from the corner. So if you just go all the way to the end and then just back stitch a few. And let's see how close I got close enough for my 1/4 inch. Sew it. Gotta make sure I don't, make sure, see there, my seam allowance wanted to flip up. So make sure that stays down. And do a little back stitch, stop at a 1/4 inch. Okay, I'm saying this out loud to myself, don't sew the whole thing shut. You're gonna come down, and I would say you're leaving, you know, about a 2 inch opening, little back stitch there. Pull that out. Now we have our little pillow. We have our little pin cushion all sewn up all the way around the outside. Now what I like to do when I am, this applies to if I'm sewing a pillow, but in these little pin cushions, I like to trim off the excess fabric in the corner. And what that's going to do is just make a better little corner and an easier corner to turn inside out. You do want to be aware of the stitching, right? We don't want to cut the stitching away. So I'm about 1/8 inch away from the actual corner where I stitched, and I just snip off that little end. And you're going to just come and do that on all 4 sides. The rest of the seam allowance, again, I did not have to be super careful, you know, about that around the outside. All right, so now we've got a cute little pillow, and I'll show you one little trick about turning something inside out is if you reach from your opening, reach down to one of the furthest corners away, and you want to pull one of those through first. So we'll see how we're poking that corner out. And that, to me, that just makes the whole thing turn inside out so much easier. Turn that. Now, you could use little leftover quilt blocks. You could piece this traditionally. But one of the things I love about piecing it on this foundation is this is really nice and stable because it's got that foundation in it. So now we're going to take our cute little pointer here and come down and just carefully just poke those little corners out. See how easy that poked out. Now, every now and then, if you have a stubborn point that doesn't want to come out, my little trick is I grab a hold of the corner or the edges right next to the corner, and I just give it a little bit of a nyeh. It's a sound effect. It's not actually a thing. It's a rrr. All right, so we're going to poke these corners out. Here's the next one up here. I like that. This works really nice. Poke this one out. And so now we're going to give that one the sound effect. See how that just kind of eases that little point out. So isn't that so fun? So now if you want to, you can give this a little press, which I'm going to. Now the other thing, because we're going to close up this opening, we're going to fold that back. So we've got this nice little clean fold on both ends. Just kind of give this a little finger press. And then let's bring this over and just give it a nice little press with the iron. Isn't that so cute? And so I'm going to press this little fold that we put in our opening, kind of press this in place, just kind of giving it some memory so that when we go to close it up, it's just really nice and manageable. All right, there is our little pincushion. Now, there's several things that you can fill these pincushions with. You can just do some polyfill stuffing, right? But I like some little extra weight. So what we're using today, these are actually ground walnut shells, and you find these at the pet store over by the kitty litter. Now, but I can't say we're going to fill it with kitty litter. That would be bad. And so I looked on the ingredients, and it is just ground shells. Another product that is a really nice thing to fill pincushions with is silica sand, which you're going to find at the hardware store. I've got this cute little funnel, and it's got a pretty good size opening here. You know, so you don't want a tiny little funnel that's going to be so hard to fill. We're going to get that down into our little hole. And then I did put this in something so that it would actually pour. And so I'm going to fill up the funnel, and then you kind of have to give it a little squeeze. See, that just made them go right down in. And because these are a little bit dense, you know, they're kind of dense and dry. They're a little bit chunky. So sometimes they're maybe a little shake or a little squeeze of that funnel. And we're going to pour all of these in there. We'll see if I did enough to fill our pincushion. Okay, I'm going to put them all in there. One more. See, I'm kind of poking it down a little bit just with the funnel, just so you kind of get them out of the way. Let's just go for it here. Okay, I just have to say that this was not pre-measured. You're going to just have to, you know, you kind of get to decide how full you want to fill up your cute little pincushion. The nice thing about the shells or the silica sand is that it gives it a really nice weight too. And so I really like that. Okay, for this next step now, we're shaking this down in, but this opening, of course, we don't want the walnut shells to be right up to the top because that would be really hard to close this up. So this is where the glue stick comes in. Let's have this sit. Is it gonna stay? It's not gonna stay. I gotta hold on to it. Get the lid off my glue stick, maybe. There we go. Sometimes those lids are tight. Okay, what I like to do with the glue stick at this point, in fact, I'm gonna do it on the background fabric so you can see it. What I like to do is I just kind of slide that glue stick in there, just kind of give it a little twirl, roll. I'm just getting some glue on the fold down here. Can you see that? This is water-soluble, starch-based, but what this is going to do is I'm going to just pinch these two folded edges together and just glue it shut. Now you're not done at this point. This is just going to make it a lot easier to sew and just manage, and you have a lot less risk of dumping walnut shells all over your space here. And so now you can, you can let that dry a second if you want to, but it's probably not really going to be going anywhere. So now our pincushion is kind of in place. Now one thing that's really nice, and my mother would be so proud, is I've got a thimble. Thimbles are really going to help, and I'm going to show you. We're going to tie a knot in the end of this. And here's one little trick that I learned many years ago. You take your needle. It does not have to be this long. This was just the one that I had. And we have the point pointing out. You take your one or two, I'm going to do 2 threads at a time. You take your 2 threads and you pinch them with that finger, and you wrap 1, 2, or 3 times. Hold on to that little knot. Poke the pin up. Now keep your fingers closed here and just pull the needle all the way up. And there's your knot in the end. So my mom would be so proud showing you that. Just to get them out of the way, I do trim just a little bit of that little extra out of the way. Now I have orange thread in here so you can see it. And you are going to just sew this up. Now there's lots of different little stitches that you can use. Any of you that do handwork are probably going to be doing a much nicer stitch than I do. So see, I'm just going to kind of poke that knot down and say, I need you to be out of the way. And we're just going to go through. You can go through all the layers if you want, but we're just going to sew this shut. So one thing that I really like to do is I like to make a bunch of pincushions at a time. And so I'm going to show you what I mean by that after I get this sewn up. But I like to have a little basket. I have a little bookshelf in my sewing room, and I have a little basket. Do not look too close at my stitching here. My mom would not be proud of my stitching. Basically, we just need to get this sewn up so that's nice and secure. And then at the end, we are going to run our needle through that loop so we can make it a little knot. Sometimes it's good to just do a couple of those. So you can see right now how much hand stitching I actually do. So there we go. And then we're just gonna redistribute those little walnut shells. I kind of like to poke them into the corner, but isn't that so fun? So I wanted to show you one other thing. So as I was laying some of these out on a panel. I really like laying out several pincushions, mug rugs, and this same technique right here applies to if you were making individual quilt blocks, because the quilts that you can see behind me, I pieced this exact same way. So you don't just need to do little projects on this foundation. You can turn this into lots of big quilts. But what I want you to notice is that I've got 6 pincushions here. Now these are 3 by 3 squares. The one we did today is 4 by 4. So that's kind of what I was talking about. You can choose how big you want these to be, but just noticing that this is 1 inch finished. This is a 1 inch finished square. So remember that these are labeled by the finished size, because that seam allowance is going to shrink these in. So what I did here is I laid out 6 different pincushions. And so now you know the process of how we fold on that fold line and sew the 1/4 inch seam. And then we're going to fold on the fold line and sew the 1/4 inch seam. So if you look at this, and if we kind of back up to the sewing part, these are all sewn, but use your imagination just a little bit. These are all ironed down. We're going to sew, sew, and then skip, right? We're skipping the row that is in between. So we're not going to sew this seam. So sew, sew, skip, and then sew, sew, right? So then we're going to take this piece and we're going to clip between each of the squares right up to the stitch line, and we're going to press seam allowances going the opposite direction. And now when we fold on that fold line to sew the seams the other direction, it's going to be, I'll turn it this way, then it's going to be sew, sew, skip, sew, sew, skip. Does that make sense? And so then when these are all done, I better put glasses on for this. When these are all sewn up, you can kind of see it on the back. All the seams are sewn except in between the blocks are not sewn. So I actually just like to cut these up with scissors instead of a rotary cutter. And either way, so we're going to just cut in between all these, and you're going to cut them all, and then you end up with all these cute little separate pincushions or quilt blocks. So I hope that you will go grab some squares and have a pincushion party at your house today, and thank you so much for joining me. If you want to see more, you can check out my website, which is 10sisters.com. I am 10 Sisters Handicraft on Instagram and Carmen Geddes Quilts on Facebook. So thanks for joining me.